Welcome to the 2025 Annual Undergraduate History Conference. I want to give a welcome to PFW students and their friends and family, to members of the Fort Wayne community, to PFW faculty and staff, to Dean Badia, to Chancellor Elsenbaumer. We thank you all for coming out to support this event. We have 3 panels, and I know you're going to enjoy what we have prepared for you because students have done a lot of hard work. I want to thank people who helped make this possible. First, I want to thank the student presenters for their hard work and courage. It takes bravery to come out here and share your ideas with a larger group. I also want to thank the history faculty because it was in the classes that the student presenters had with them that they helped the students figure out topics, figure out sources, look at drafts, refine those drafts, that whole process of writing a paper in a history class. I also want to thank Alyssa Anguiana for helping with the setup, Parker Tysinger for helping create the flyers and advertising. Terry Luce every year is in charge of the event, in the planning of it, the ordering the food, the setup. She's invaluable. I want to thank her very much for that. Ann Livshes organized the event and the program for the day. I want to thank her for that. Why don't we give everybody who helped out in this a round of applause. Thank you so much. It couldn't have happened with all the hard work of all these people. This is certainly a worthwhile effort because here we are and we've created this academic conference. And I see conferences sort of as a collective learning experience, a place where we can exchange ideas and dialogue with one another. And in that vein, I encourage people in the audience to ask questions and make comments at the appropriate times because those comments and questions will help presenters improve and refine their work. The conference is also important for presenters' professional development. It's going to help you practice your presentation skills. It also might help you build intellectual and professional networks. People hear about what you're doing and they're interested and want to sort of collaborate or work with you in some way or another. It's also something to put on your resume. And if you ever ask for a letter of reference, a faculty member can say, I saw X student present at the annual conference and it was wonderful. So it helps you in that way. I never had an opportunity to present a paper as an undergraduate. We didn't have that at my university, and even though it was a big university. And I think it's great that the presenters who are presenting today took the opportunity to do that. And maybe there's some students here who haven't presented yet. We'll do it next year. I certainly encourage you to do that. So before starting, I wanted to acknowledge that this is the 15th anniversary of the annual Undergraduate History Conference. We started the conference in 2009. We've had it every year since then. 2020 and 2021, we didn't really have conferences. We had sort of alternative things that were wonderful, but it can't be counted as conferences, as full-scale conferences. So this year, 2025, is the 15th annual anniversary. And so I did a little number crunching about it. So over these 15 years, there's been 56 panels and 176 presentations. And I looked at some of the panels and just kind of the nature of them, the topics, et cetera. And I found out that we've had panels on the United States, Mexico, and Latin America, Europe, the Soviet Union, world history, the Atlantic world, and local Fort Wayne history. In terms of time period, we span the ancient world through the 20th century. In terms of topics, we've had war, genocide, the Holocaust, revolution, imperialism, espionage, state development, reform movements. I mean, this isn't everything, but this is some of the highlights. Some of the groups we've looked at. Panels have been on the CIA, the Catholic Church, American presidents. There's been a wide range of types of history that have been covered in the conference. Political history, social history, cultural history, women's history, gender history, the history of marginalized groups, history of race relations. We've also had extracurricular learning. We've had a panel of public history. We actually had a panel on internships from a student who had an internship with Arch and actually ended up getting a job with Arch. So a nice thing about this conference, actually this year we have a record number of non-history majors participating. But over all these years, it hasn't just been something that's benefited history majors, but many other majors. Basically, it's anyone who takes a history class, and if they write a paper in it and they want to present it, they go through the process, et cetera, et cetera. And so here are the majors that have presented at the conference over the years. Elementary education, middle school education, secondary education, social studies education, anthropology, biology, communications, economics and finance, English, general studies, German, history, international language and culture studies, legal studies, political science, psychology, sociology, theater, and women's studies. And presenters have gone on to do great things. Obviously, their presentation of the conference is just one professional development experience and one thing that goes on their resume. But nonetheless, they have gone on to do wonderful things. Many have gone to graduate and professional schools. Many have earned scholarships to do so. We've had some Fulbright scholars who had previously presented at the conference. We have a lot of teachers. People went on to be teachers at the elementary level, middle school, high school, and university. We've had people get jobs in library science, museum studies, historical preservation, law, research, business, journalism, city government, public relations, human resources, sales and marketing, a whole range of things that this conference, again, wasn't the only event, but it was helping build their professional development as they went on to be successful. So obviously, this event has been important, and given that it's the 15th anniversary of it, we thought it was only fitting to recognize Dr. Ann Lifshitz for her exceptional work doing this conference. So it has been, it was her idea in 2009. Since then, she's really been the force behind it and leading planning and organizing the conference every year and just doing an exceptional job on behalf of our students. And, this is an incredible service. It's helped so many people, and it's enriched the university community. So we have a plaque for her. And so here you go. And I'll read what it says. Ann Lifshitz, congratulations on this wonderful 15th anniversary milestone of the annual Undergraduate History Conference in 2025. In recognition of your outstanding work creating and overseeing the conference every year, with gratitude and appreciation for your hard work and dedication, the History Department.
This is not part of the play.
I know.
This is not part of my play.
Since it wasn't very colorful, we added some flowers to it.
I should have suspected something was off because the flowers were also not part of the plan. Well, I'm not going to cry, but thank you. Thank you so much for this. It's been a labor of love, but I do think that this is very much a collective endeavor by the department, and I couldn't be more proud of the fact that we as a department have been able to sustain it for as many years as we have. We have people in the audience who have presented at past conferences. We have people who are coming back for a second presentation. We have a lot of first-time presenters, and every year the students do such an amazing job, and the greatness of the conference really is the quality of our student, no pressure, but the quality of our student presenters and how amazing our students are, and how proud we are of all of them. So thank you so much.
Sure. And with that, I guess we move on to the first panel.
Yes. And I forgot to change the PowerPoint. So.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Okay. The first panel can come up. So the panelists in their illustrious chairs will sit at the table, and I will pull up your PowerPoint.
Thank you. Are you the first one? Yes, I'm okay. Can I have you put this on real quick? Yeah, hold on a second. Might have to help me here just a little bit. You're gonna be fine. You got this. I'm an instructor, so this is not too bad. Oh, perfect. Good. And then if I could just kind of have you stick that in your pocket. Hold on, let me do this out of the way. Yeah, that should be okay. All right, there you go. Hold on a second here.
All right, well, hello. Thank you, everybody. I'll be the third to thank everyone and welcome. Thanks for being here early this morning for the first panel. And it is my honor to chair this first panel titled World History and American Politics. So I guess what I'll do, since Sam is already up there, is just kind of introduce each speaker one at a time, and then if you can hold off applause till the end of the panel, that would be awesome. So first up, we have Sam Frick, whose presentation is called The Annexation of Texas, the Political Discussions and Challenges in U.S. and Mexican Politics.
All right. Boy, I don't know if I can top what we just had before this presentation here, but I'm here to talk about, obviously, the annexation of Texas. Even 180 some years later, it is still relevant in the modern political atmosphere and the stratosphere of American and Mexican politics, as you can see here. So to kick things off, I want to talk about manifest testing, right? As stated by the Oxford Dictionary, the 19th century doctrine or belief that expansion in the United States was destined, right, both justified and inevitable because God told them it was justifiable to expand. So to establish what the map looks like back in 1837, as you can see here, you have your slave states in the south, your free states in the north, and then eventually when we get to the Missouri Compromise in 1803, all this land from Arkansas, Missouri, and up to Minnesota, that is going to be acquired by the United States in a purchase deal with the French. Obviously, by 1837, you're going to have the Republic of Texas, because by that point, they've won the Mexican Revolution. and seceded from Mexican control. And then anything west of the Republic of Texas, that's anything still controlled by Mexico by that point, and then the territory of Oregon. Briefly, I want to state a timeline of what things took place leading up to the annexation of Texas. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson signed the Louisiana Purchase in July 4th of 1803. Interestingly, when looking up the research on the annexation of Texas, he argued that the Rio Grande was part of that Louisiana Purchase. Well, as it turned out, that did not go so well in those negotiations, but that is going to foreshadow what's going to come in future discussions and political discussions that is going to set up the Mexican Revolution and all the events leading up to follow that. September 23rd, 1810, you had the start of the West Florida Revolt, which is the main event that is going to set up the Adams-Onis Treaty, where essentially it is a deal where the U.S. would acquire Florida, which seceded from the Spanish. Florida was then known as the New Spain until the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, which was signed into legislation on February 22nd of 1819. As you might expect, not a popular deal amongst the American politics, as constituents criticized that the Americans missed an opportunity of acquiring that land in Texas, whereas some American politicians were convinced that acquiring Florida was more of a priority than Texas, to which eventually the Spanish would still have control of Mexico until August 21st of 1821 in a battle of its own between the Mexicans and the Spanish army. Mexico declared independence from Spain, forming a new government, new identity, a new way of policy, so to speak. And it's very important to mention the Declaration of Independence from Mexico because it sets the stage for future conflicts with the United States. Slavery is a big issue during this point, divided topic amongst the U.S., as you saw on that map earlier. March 6th of 1820, obviously, James Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise with the free states in the north and then the southern states, plus Missouri, becoming slave states. This leads to the debates on whether Texas should be a free state or a slave state. And I know from my various research when researching about Texas, this was an ongoing discussion amongst the two rival parties. Eventually, as things transpired going in the 1830s and so forth, they went to the introduction of the practice of slavery into Texas. Briefly, the pros and cons. I only just went with a couple of main points to keep things quick here. Some of the pros, obviously, manifest destiny. You know, it's that dream of being able to expand westward and take control of this unclaimed land. And then according to a journal from Rathburn of 2001, they want to become an economically self-sufficient nation. It's not just the fact that you're pursuing this for the greater American purpose, American good, but also to become an economically powerful nation. You know, if you have more land to control, obviously you are building a country of resources and alliance on your side. Some of the cons, again, as I mentioned from the Adams-Onis Treaty, some politicians felt Florida was more valuable to them than Texas, and there was this ongoing fear of war with Mexico. And one man that really was a key part of the Texas Revolution was Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, born in Virginia, raised in southwestern Missouri, played an integral role in the Missouri Compromise, in a system of the impresario system, I should say, successfully led the first colonization of 300 Anglo-American families or immigrants of English ancestry to Texas. Now, during this time, the Mexican government had allowed these immigrants to settle in Texas, although with some concerns as things started to loom regarding American consideration of acquiring Texas from Mexico. Stephen F. Austin became the liaison with the Mexican government. In other words, he was the mouthpiece negotiating peaceful talks, trying to find middle ground between the American and Mexican politicians, trying to find peace, trying to avoid that ongoing war that would eventually happen after the annexation of Texas. Became an influential figure in Texas's independence. He pushed for Texas independence. He eventually formed the Texas Rangers law enforcement that still exists today. There's a university called Stephen F. Austin. Just an influential man of all different types of reasons from the political standpoint, a social standpoint. He would also become the first Secretary of State until his death in 1836. The Texas Revolution started on October 2nd of 1835. U.S., as I mentioned earlier, eyed expansion. And during this time, Mexico abolished slavery, where the U.S. still was pushing for slavery during this time. That was going to be an issue by that point. So then, in addition to Texas getting tired of this feeling disrespected by the Mexican politicians and the Mexican government, they pushed their frustrations towards Mexico, and then also the Mexican government became more centralized, where previously became a decentralized government, and eventually the two sides clashed. Now, I could go on and on about the Texas Revolution, but I want to quickly mention the Battle of the Alamo, which was a 13-day siege where the Mexican army, I should say, sieged San Antonio, Texas. The Alamo, which is a fortress or a Spanish mission in San Antonio, Texas, became the site of the Revolution's most important battle. And it left a legacy on Texan sovereignty. The quotes, as you see on the screen, remember the Alamo, because it highlights the violence of the Alamo and how significant the Texas Revolution was to the hearts and the minds of the Texans today. Path to annexation looks like this. Following the battle in San Juancito, which came 6 weeks after the Battle of Alamo, Sam Houston was elected as president of the Republic of Texas. However, annexation was temporarily delayed due to the ongoing discussions between the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, which would set the stage for the 1844 presidential election, where James K. Polk was competing in a campaign against Henry Clay, and the annexation of Texas became a huge part on the presidential election, to which James K. Polk won in a narrow victory in that election. And eventually, once James K. Polk went into office, him and John Tyler motioned the annexation of Texas, where Texas was officially a state on December 29th, 1845. The aftermath of the annexation of Texas is significant in a variety of different ways. Shortly after the annexation of Texas, President Polk declared war on Mexico on April 25th, 1846, what would be known as the Mexican-American War. And with the victory in the Mexican-American War, it forced the Mexicans to sell that land that would eventually become New Mexico, parts of Arizona and Colorado, to the United States, and Polk oversaw the largest territorial expansion in American history. The annexation of Texas, in a lot of ways, largely contributed to the U.S. Civil War. And while the Whig Party would still be around for a couple more elections, this was the beginning of the end for the Whig Party. And by the time they lost in their 1854 election, which set the stage for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party eventually dissolved. So again, with the annexation of Texas, we still talk about it today because of the issues that surround the debates and discussions on the territory, the border between Texas and Mexico, the immigration policy that led to the alliance of NATO between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And to this day, one of the most significant moments in the history of the political relationship between the United States and Mexico. Thank you for taking your time to listen to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed what I spoke here today.
Okay. Hi, guys. You got my little introduction. So I'm going to be focusing on the Mexican muralist movement that happened in Mexico in the post-revolutionary era. And the two main figureheads that I'm going to be focusing on are Rivera and Siqueiros. I want to state that they were not only Mexican muralists. This is just a little part of their career that helped move forward a nationalist movement within Mexico, as well as shape the Mexican identity in the post-revolutionary era. Okay, so my three main objectives, I'm going to examine 6 pieces of art, one from each artist, and in 3 themes. And those 3 themes are indigenous imagery, Mexican heritage, and the Spanish conquest, and how each of these artists interpreted these type of themes within their artworks. Okay. Oh, it's important to note that there is much crossover between these 3 themes. Because Mexican heritage, indigenous imagery, indigenous lifestyle comes in with Mexican heritage. But I am going to show you artworks in relation to Mexican heritage that aren't drawing on indigenous imagery, because I think it is important to separate the two. Okay. So for the first one, I'm going to do indigenous imagery. And this is Rivera's work. And this is the La Gran Tiochtitlan. I'm sorry, I do not speak Spanish. I'm trying my best here. And Rivera, as you will see, he tends to take a more idealized and romanticized approach with his works. And this will be a critique of Siqueiros. Siqueiros does not like this. And you'll see with his works, it's a lot more raw. And Siqueiros is a lot more politically charged than Rivera. And so you will also see that as a reoccurring theme within Siqueiros' work. Okay, so what La Gran Tiochtitlan presented, drawing on the romanticized and idealized, is that Rivera was presenting the Aztec Empire. And what he was doing is he was presenting forth the idea that the Aztecs were innovative, they were advanced, and they were culturally inclined. And this is important in the context of the post-revolutionary era because we're seeing a breakage of colonial heritage in relation to the Spanish, that happened from the Spanish conquest. So here he's trying to draw on sentiments of, look, we don't need them. We were better off without them. And we'll also see that when he paints the Spanish conquest, it will be portrayed as destructive. And so with that, he's calling on primarily the northern Mexicans to assimilate themselves and understand, hey, this is an area that you should be prideful about, and create a national sentiment of prideful nationalism. And with that, I want to present a quote from Rivera to kind of embody his thought process. In the pre-Hispanic world, everything in the life of the people was artistic, from the palaces and the temples, which are monumental works of sculpture. And this is praising the indigenous life. But in contrast, we will see with Siqueiros' work in relation to indigenous imagery, is that Siqueiros did not romanticize the indigenous life. Rather, he critiqued what Rivera was doing and said, hey, this is not so great and awesome. So he had a different format than Rivera. And the reason for this is he wanted to separate folklorism from indígenism. And so what the difference was is that folklorism tends to romanticize, as I said, a capturing of a country's past. And so he wanted to properly showcase the struggles and the dynamics that the indigenous people had faced. And he did that with his America Tropical. And we can see here, we have an indigenous person on the cross. And one thing to point out is with Siqueiros, he will present the Mayans, and Rivera will present the Aztecs. And this was just a little difference between the two. And so he wanted to, the point of this painting in particular was to place on the forefront to the Mexican population, the current Mexican population in the post-revolutionary era, of the harassment and the persecution that the indigenous people had faced. And so he's drawing a connection here between what is happening with the Mexican people in the post-revolutionary era and what had happened with the indigenous people in the past. Okay. Oh, and it's also creating a point of consciousness for the Mexican people to be like, hey, stay together, unify yourself. Here's our previous past. Here's our previous struggles. Here's our current struggles, and here's our future. And this helps to push that forward. Okay, so now I would like to move into Mexican heritage. And with Siqueiros and Rivera, it will be a celebration of Mexican heritage. It will not be destructive, it will not be cruel, it will not be brutal. And so I think what's important to note here, the difference between indigenous imagery and Mexican heritage, is that the Mexican heritage is not just the indigenous past. It's also the food, the language, the culture, the music, and so forth. And so this is Rivera's Day of the Dead work, and this is a really renowned piece. This has been seen everywhere, and it's still very relevant today in current Mexican culture. And so what it's doing here is that Day of the Dead it has an individual uniqueness to Mexican culture. And I would like to note that Mexico is not the only country that celebrates deceased ones and remembers deceased loved ones, but Day of the Dead in particular and how the Mexican society celebrates is unique to Mexico. And so with that, we can see, and this is 3,000 years old. The Day of the Dead celebration links back to the Aztecs. This is 3,000 years old. He's presenting something in current times that they all know of and they all appreciate within their culture. And so it's used as a small embodiment to a larger picture of what the Mexican identity is. I mean, this is just a little piece of what the Mexican identity is and what their culture is. And so I think it's important to understand that. Okay. And as I mentioned, Siqueiros is a lot more politically charged than Rivera is, and we can see that. So as I had mentioned, the Day of the Dead is a celebration that is nearly 3,000 years old. But the revolutionaries, this is more recent. This is more recent to Mexican heritage. This is something that happened 5, 10, 15 years ago to the Mexican people. And so with that, I think this is calling on them to highlight this historical event of the Mexican Revolution and to commemorate what these individuals did to gain their sovereignty. And so it's sparking that nationalist sentiment that, hey, you guys did good. Here's a work to commemorate you. And it also highlights the persistence of the Mexican civilians during the dictatorship of President Diaz. And now I'm going to move on to the Spanish conquest. And this is a key comparison point for Rivera and Siqueiros. They will depict the Spanish conquest as destructive. And it differs. Siqueiros' work will be a lot more abstract than that of Rivera. And this is, I think, this painting of the exploitation of Mexico with the Spanish conquistadors is a perfect example of how many Mexicans, as well as Mexicans, how they interpreted their indigenous past and what the Spanish conquest did to their history. And so this work, this is by Rivera, and I said the name, Exploitation of Mexico, Spanish Conquistadors. This was a huge mural, and I'm going to break it down in parts for effectiveness reasons because there is different parts within the mural that highlight different things, but overall it is a complete embodiment of the Spanish conquest. So with that, overall, the painting itself, it highlights the blatant exploitation of indigenous people, financial and political corruption, as well as colonization and the overthrow of indigenous Mexico. So over here, okay, in the upper left-hand corner, you can see Spanish vessels/ships. And this will be the introduction of Spaniards into Mexico, or that is what this is presenting. And then as we move forward into the picture, like as it comes closer to us, the viewers, you will see that the conditions worsen for the indigenous people. And we can see the introduction of Christianity here with the cross and an indigenous person bowing to the cross. And so with that, we can also see the lynching of indigenous people and as well as the exploitation of indigenous people with hard work, hard labor. And then with Siqueiros, he presented, this is a lot more abstract, and I understand that, and I apologize. But I'm gonna do my best attempt. So this is Death to the Invader by Siqueiros, and what it's presenting is we have the introduction of the Spanish conquistadors within Mexico, and you can see down below that there is indigenous people fighting back, and then this is meant to draw a comparison point. Okay, this is what you did to break from the dictatorship of Siqueiros, or not Siqueiros, from Diaz. This is what you did to break from the dictatorship of Rivera. We've done it once, we can do it again, and we will succeed. And the red is meant to highlight the bloodshed by the indigenous people in order to protect their homeland. And so, because I'm running out of time, why does it matter? I think the Mexican muralist movement matters for a multitude of reasons, but it matters in the context of the 20th century because it helped move forward and justify the Mexican Revolution as well as promote the Mexican identity. and as well as justify the newfound Mexican or the resurgence of Mexican nationalism within the post-revolutionary era. And I think today, murals are a vital part of Mexican culture even today, and they really connect themselves and resonate with them. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, let's just jump in. I'm sorry. So I would like to start by first giving a brief history of kind of what the CIA was doing around this time. And I think it's important to note that this is the kind of the peak of the Cold War. We're looking at 1960. So we're going to look at a couple cases that happened slightly before the one that we're going to be talking about today, which is the Congo crisis of 1960 into 1961. And these two cases are Operation Ajax and Operation PB Success. These two cases, I think, are very important in understanding that the CIA kind of had a blueprint for how they did their covert actions at this time, especially when it came to situations where a country was nationalizing resources, which is what you will see in both Guatemala and in Iran here. Iran is Operation Ajax. They nationalized their oil reserves and kind of ousted BP, British Petroleum. So those fancy green gas stations that you drive past all the time have a bit of a nefarious history in the Middle East. And your luxurious bananas with the blue labels, the Chiquita bananas, those also have a history of exploitation in the country of Guatemala, where the United Fruit Company took a lot of land and was not sharing the resources with the people. And then when their influence was diminished in the region, the CIA got involved, and it was not pretty for the government there. They exiled the leadership, and in both instances, they installed a puppet government that was very abusive to the natives. Okay, so I'd like to let you guys know I'm gonna be the bummer today. So the next images are not gonna be very they're going to be very graphic. They're not gonna be very fun. So if you look away, I won't be offended. But we're gonna talk about the colonial period. Yes, it's not the images yet. It's just bullet points. We'll get there. I promise. But we're gonna talk about the colonial history of the Congo. In the late 19th century, European powers, mainly, the ones you would think of, Belgium, the UK, Spain, France, Italy, the United States. We're not in Europe, but one of the gang. They came in and they were dividing up the continent, and one of the most profitable territories was the Congo, because as you can see, they have an abundance of all of those resources, and they have a lot of them. Belgium was in charge of the Congo territory. They took it over, and they were mainly interested in the rubber and the diamonds there. And in order to keep a hold on these resources, they used a lot of very aggressive tactics to keep the people in check, including forced labor, sexual assault, murder. But what they were very known for, and this is what the pictures are, is bodily mutilation. Most notably, the removal of one's hands if they refuse to work. And that is what the pictures are going to show. So if you would not like to see that, now is your chance to look away. This would happen to people of any age. As you can see, very young boys particularly would have their hands removed if they weren't working fast enough, or if they refused in general. And as you can see, it also did happen to adults. So I won't make you guys stare at them forever. We can move on now. So this sparked a revolution. As you can imagine, people did not want to live under this oppressive regime forever. And this came to an era of independence across all of Africa, but it was especially strong within the Congo because of how brutal the Belgians were. And this man, Patrice Lumumba, would be a very powerful leader during that revolution. And eventually, tensions kind of peaked in the year 1960, June to be exact, when a Congolese regiment from the military overthrew their Belgian officers and actually completed the uprising and took their land back. They held an election, and Patrice Lumumba was elected to be the first prime minister, along with Joseph Kasavubu, who became the first president. They had a two-party government with two leaders sharing power. But it wouldn't all be good for him from here. Pretty much immediately, there was a lot of tension with factions forming within the country. Mainly in the Katanga region, there were people who were still loyal to the Belgians because they gained favor with them and were able to capitalize off of the resources. And they didn't really like the nationalization because they lost some of their power in the region. And they were led by a man named Moise Tshombe, who will be very important moving forward. Him and the Belgians worked very closely to try to destabilize the government that Lumumba was trying to build within the Congo. And as they began to pressure him, Lumumba came to the United States and the United Nations and requested help, which he was denied. They actually took sides with Tshombe, even though he was trying to secede from what was becoming a peaceful government. Lumumba very much so wanted to replicate Western ideals and have a republican democracy, much like the United States, which you would think would prime him to be an ally of Western nations. But his anti-imperialist nature made him come across as very radical to the West, and especially the Belgians saw him as a threat to their control in the region. Desperate for help, he went to the USSR, which during the Cold War is the biggest no-no that you can do to the United States. And the CIA agent who was in charge of the region, Larry Devlin, immediately took notice of this request, and he sent a message to the director of the CIA, Alan Dulles, and told him that the Congo is experiencing a classic communist takeover. Whether Lumumba is an actual commie or just playing the commie game is unknown, but there may be little time to avoid another Cuba. Dulles did not take this lightly, and he immediately called President Eisenhower, who also did not take this lightly, and immediately put out a kill order on Lumumba. So these are going to be the men from the CIA who are basically charged with orchestrating the execution of Lumumba. Sidney Gottlieb is the CIA's top poison specialist, and Larry Devlin, as I said before, was the man in charge of the operation in the Congo. Their plan was to basically dose everything that Lumumba might ever touch with what most people believe was probably cyanide. They were planning to put it in his toothpaste, everything that he would be drinking or eating for a couple days. But leading up to the night of the actual planned assassination, Devlin got cold feet. He said in his autobiography that he was overcome with guilt because he probably knew that he was killing a good man, and he couldn't go through with it. So they actually went with a plan B, which is where our next character kind of comes in, Mobutu Sese Seko. They paid him, who was I'm sorry, that was terrible grammar. He was the leader of the Binza group, the military in the Congo. They paid him $250,000 to execute Lumumba. So this led to the capture of Lumumba and 10 of his closest advisors. They were captured and taken to the Katanga region and held in Thysville prison. They were held there for a couple months. They weren't allowed much food, water. They weren't allowed to have shoes. And in his letter, Lumumba penned two famous letters, one to his wife and one to the United Nations General Secretary, stating that he hasn't had water, he hasn't seen the sun in months, and he knows that his time is pretty much coming short, but he's asking for help from the United Nations, and they once again ignored him. From there, he was transferred to Elizabethville in the Katanga region, where Tshombe was very eager to get his hands on him, and there him and his men were executed. We know that his advisors were executed by firing squad, but because of the way Lumumba was executed, it's unclear what his actual cause of death was. There was no remains found, but it is known that his body was dismembered and dissolved in sulfuric acid, and all that was remaining was his tooth, which is now on display at a museum, I believe, in Belgium. So after this point, the CIA was building a new government within the Congo, and they kind of went through a quick string of puppet leaders. First was a man named Sarira Aldula, who only served for about 90 days. He was very unpopular. He couldn't really do much with the government, and he was overthrown by Moise Shumbe. And after that point, there was a civil war that lasted about 3 months where 100,000 people were killed. And the CIA was kind of fed up with the region and all of the turmoil, and they eventually just gave the power to Mobutu, and they gave him an unlimited budget to overthrow the government, which he was able to do in a 3-day bloodless coup where he completely purged the government and took power, claiming himself as a dictator. He immediately made all political opposition illegal, and he remained in power for decades, not allowing anyone in the government to have power that rivaled his, and the people of the Congo never were able to have another democracy like they had under Lumumba, which only lasted about 6 months. Thank you guys for listening.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to be the first one to congratulate our 3 presenters on 3 really fascinating papers, different but so many interesting themes in world history, to kick off the conference. And our tradition is that after the panel has finished delivering their papers, we turn it over to the audience. And Dr. Weiner has a great story about his dad and his grad school and asking questions that I forget the details of. But the message is that asking questions is really one of the great ways to kind of get into the meat of these research projects a little bit more. As you guys can imagine, distilling what was probably hours and hours of research that these 3 did into a 10-minute presentation was a lot of work, which means their knowledge goes much, much deeper than what we heard. So any questions that you guys may have related to what they presented on, or a sort of expanded version of that topic. So Dr. Lipschitz has a microphone. I saw McKenna had her hand up, and Dr. Schuster.
I did forget about the microphone. All right, this one's for Jaythen. How did the CIA take accountability for the crimes and the destruction of democracy they committed in the Congo? Or if they did at all?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, I found a lot of my information through the Freedom of Information Act. Like, they released some of the documents, but when you go through, they redacted, like, everything that has actual evidence of their culpability, except for, I mean, what I found was mainly through the autobiography that actually told me what the CIA did during that time, so.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. These are 3 great topics, well presented, so I enjoyed it. And one of the things that I found most evocative actually came from Breehonies, where she talked about how our identities are shaped by these stories of our past, whether it be Manifest Destiny or any of them. My question to you, and this goes to all 3 of you, is as you are reading these papers and as you're doing your research, and also as you are paying attention to how there's attempts to influence how places like the Smithsonian are telling history, does that make you change the way you understand your role in talking about history? Have you become more self-conscious or changed the way you've thought about history, realizing that there are attempts to influence the way, for instance, academics and museums tell it?
Yeah.
Yes. Because I think that's why it's so important to read so many different sources, even from both ends of the spectrum, to create kind of a middle point in where you stand when you write about history. So
I think for me, when I did my research into annexation of Texas, one of the things I tackled when undergoing the 20 plus pages of research of the annexation of Texas was trying to find different perspectives of how people viewed the annexation try to figure out how the media. So one of the things I found in terms of primary sources was finding newspapers that covered the discussions of Texas at that time, looking for ways in which how the information was manipulated and perceived during that time amongst the public, amongst politicians, how the Whig Party and its opposition felt about the annexation of Texas. And I think looking back at the history and looking through all the diaries, the resources and whatnot, it gave me a different way into which how I appreciate, as a researcher, appreciate the ways in which the people that made all these changes that occurred in Texas and in the Mexican government. It gave me a different perspective in which how we as researchers should analyze events like this today and how it relates to things that we're seeing here in the modern era of foreign policy. You know, the word annex is being used in 2025. Never would I imagine in 2025 that I would see that word in today's mainstream media. Now, I did this research back in 2024 in a different administration, and now with today, I hear this word today, and it's like, boy, I did not have that in my bingo card at all. But I mean, I just think that's one of the reasons why I think history has such a beautiful rhetoric in terms of how we analyze, how we take things beyond the bare bones of its artificial history and text.
This is something that we talked about a lot in Dr. Bauer's class, especially with this being a course over espionage. I mean, people are going to lie, and it's going to be like the information is going to be very hard to come by. So I definitely had to look at everything through a lens of skepticism. And like in my previous question, they didn't really want to say what they did there, and there was a lot of redacted information. So I think there was a lens of skepticism through everything I researched.
My question's for Bree. Many art historians, myself included, believe that murals that are looking to inspire people can be considered propaganda. And I'm very curious what your thoughts on, while also noting that not all propaganda has to be bad.
Yeah, no, it probably was, considering it was commissioned by the government to paint these because of a literacy problem in Mexico. So yeah, I mean, it was probably propaganda to push towards a certain sentiment. But yeah, I mean, but they did other works, but Siqueiros was really politically charged. So I think you could argue all of his works were propaganda one way or another, besides maybe his self-portrait. But even then, that could be. I don't know. So yeah, I would think so. Anything else? Nope.
Going back to, so I have a comment and then one question. And going back to Schuster's question, I think one of the most important things about studying history is how future generations will look at, you know, the CIA operations that we're doing today. You know, we go back and try and study these CIA operations and we see how much is redacted. And it creates problems for future generations and how we can objectively analyze different scenarios to see, you know, we didn't just kill 5,000 rebels, we put down 50,000 innocent civilians. Or people at the Alamo. I mean, it's really hard to think about, you know, imagine you're some soldier at the Alamo 200 years ago thinking about how people might be coming here to where I fought this battle 200 years from now to analyze how that battle affected my country going 200 years forward. And then another 200 years, and another 200 years. So I think one of the most important things about history is being able to preserve information and show what our world is like and just how important it is to preserve information, especially with like the Smithsonian and how we're kind of deleting history. But my question is for you. And so you said Stephen F. Austin died in 1836. Did he die, do you know if he died of something unrelated, just of cancer, or was he a valiant war fighter? Any
to the war, that's what you're talking, to the revolution that you're talking about. It was after that, yeah.
I imagine he was on a horse fighting through battle and fell valiantly.
I'm sure there's a version of history that involves him doing exactly that.
So this question's for Bree. I appreciated all your guys' presentations, but you, especially as someone who studied cultural history and like the ideas of art and how that influences history and influences people's like perception on history. How I know you talked about the differences in how they presented their art and how their styles really signified different ideologies in their art. So how did Mexican people at the time and also like even today, how did those influences and those different looks at the past influence today's ideologies and their ways of viewing these pictures, these murals?
I think it's something that really resonates with the Mexican people, and I think it's something that they culturally assimilate themselves to. And I think it's a point of like pridefulness and a point of nationalism for them today as what it was in the 20th century. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. My question is for Jaythen. You said that the CIA paid Mobutu to do the assassination. Did the CIA continue to support him after the assassination?
They I don't know if I mentioned this part, but after it came to constructing his government, they actually told him that he could have basically whatever he wanted. Like it said an unlimited amount of money to reconstruct the government, which I didn't know they had access to unlimited amounts of money, but
They did.
yeah, that was the exact verbiage was unlimited money for this. Yeah. It was yeah, they continued to support him I think all the way up until the point that he was actually ousted from the country.
Yeah, we probably have time for maybe one more question.
Is there anybody who hasn't asked yet? Well, then that's a perfect bookend.
All right, great time. All right, mine is for Sam. Sorry, I have my questions here so I didn't forget them. How does the discussions on the annexation of Texas influence Texan identity today?
Well, I like I mentioned earlier, I think because of the way in which Mexican-American relations were still in its early stages, the annexation of Texas is extremely important because it allows us to understand and analyze how complicated the relationship was, and even still is today, between a Mexican and American politics. Even today, if not only with the current American administration, but also with what's going on down in Mexico, the first female president, if I recall, in the history of Mexico is currently in office right now. Like 1845, that's not even remotely a consideration at that time. So the annexation of Texas educates today's citizens in Texas because it shows us where American history kind of developed over the course of history. Also, keep this in mind, not too long after the annexation of Texas, which is around 16 years later, you got the U.S. Civil War going on. So it changes everything about modern American and Mexican politics for the next 130, 160, 170 years, I should say. And I think that's why it was very important for me to do research on the annexation of Texas, because there's always been this very complicated relationship. And even today with the NATO alliance, I still always wonder about how people look back at the NATO alliance today as opposed to now and how much that would have changed. I always look back at in the annexation of Texas thinking, what would American politics or Mexican politics look like today had the United States not been successful in the process of Texas seceding from the Mexican government and eventually being annexed by the United States? What if Henry Clay won the presidential election? Right? Henry Clay made a really good argument about why the United States should not annexed Texas, which was why the election was tightly contested. And so when I always look back in the research, I always look back at all the things I wrote and research into this topic. I always wonder what would history look like today if the reverse effect happened at that point. So that's the way I look at it with this research.
Well, let's give our panelists one final round of applause. I think now's everybody's chance to refill your coffee, take a restroom break, and be back here for the next panel.